Hi folks, Matt McSpirit here, Program Manager at Microsoft, here to take you on a tour of the new Azure Stack HCI. But before we get into showing Azure Stack HCI, it's important to understand just what it is. And for those that aren't familiar, Azure Stack HCI is the newest member of the Azure Stack portfolio. It joins Azure Stack Edge, an AI-enabled edge computing device with powerful network data transfer capabilities, and Azure Stack Hub, where you can build and run applications using consistent Azure services, including IaaS and PaaS services like the Azure App Service, on-premises to meet regulatory and technical requirements, and even operate completely disconnected from Azure itself. But back to Azure Stack HCI, some of you may be thinking it's been around for a while. How is it the newest member? Well, you're right. Azure Stack HCI was around in a previous form, specifically a reference architecture and validation program, which used Windows Server 2019 at its core, running on new or existing hardware from our great ecosystem of OEM partners. The new Azure Stack HCI is a purpose-built offering, a new operating system in itself, delivered as an Azure service, but still running on existing or new hardware from our OEM partners in your chosen environments. And what it delivers is a world-class hyper-converged infrastructure stack. In other words, software from Azure that includes our latest hypervisor and built-in software-defined storage and networking that you install on servers you control on your premises. And this software is delivered as an Azure hybrid service. It's monitored, supported, licensed, and billed through Microsoft Azure. And if you've already got an Azure subscription, it's very easy to get started, as we'll see. There's no upfront license you need to buy, and critically important, Azure Stack HCI is designed with the needs of IT front and center. So it's familiar to manage and operate, and you can run Azure Stack HCI on your choice of hardware from your preferred vendor and continue using the tools and processes your team already knows to manage virtual machines. So let's take a look at getting started and how we stand up an Azure Stack HCI cluster. So what we have here is a single Azure Stack HCI node that we've deployed already using our traditional deployment methods. It's joined to the domains. I've done some basic configuration here using the sconfig interface. And I've also defined some very basic network settings as well so we can connect to the system. But we're going to perform the rest of the configuration from the Windows Admin Center. So let's hop over there now. And then to start the cluster creation, we're going to click Add. And we're going to go through the Create New Cluster experience in Windows Admin Center. So you'll notice we've got a couple of options here to create not only a traditional Windows Server cluster, but now a new Azure Stack HCI Hyper-converged cluster. And in addition to that, once we've selected that, we have a couple of additional options to choose from, specifically the ability to create a cluster in a single site, or the option to create a hyper-converged cluster that spans two sites in what we call a stretch cluster, which is unique functionality to Azure Stack HCI, which is pretty cool. So let's click Create there. We can read the prereqs. We can bring in the servers that we want to form the basis of this cluster, but I've done that ahead of time. And we can also use Admin Center to join the Azure Stack HCI nodes to the domain, but I've done that ahead of time to save a little bit of time here. We can use Admin Center to install any necessary features that Azure Stack HCI requires. Again, I've done that ahead of time. We can also use Admin Center to define any updates that we require. In this case, we're all patched and fully up to date. Any solution updates that apply to our specific hardware. And we can restart the servers if necessary before continuing the process. But in this case, I'm just going to proceed on, verifying my network connectivity. In this case, each of our servers has 4 network adapters. And we're going to designate one of those network adapters to be the management network or management adapter or interface. You could obviously team these as well. Now we're going to verify and apply those changes. That's all good. So we'll click Next. We can then define our networks for the infrastructure. And I've done a lot of this ahead of time, but I could use this interface here to actually define the IP addresses, the names, the subnet mask, and the VLAN IDs of our respective network adapters ahead of building our cluster. So we're going to apply and test the settings that we've got in place, and it's going to enforce or apply any changes we've made. And then it's going to test the connectivity to ensure that our cluster can communicate effectively across all of the different interfaces that we've defined. So that's all good, so we can click Next. We can then choose to define our virtual switch for our virtual machine communication. I'm going to select just one of our respective NICs to become our virtual switch. Click Apply. It's going to take a second or two to apply those specific vSwitch changes. Then it's going to test connectivity again to ensure that everything can still communicate. And then we're all done. So next we're on to validating the cluster. Now, when we run cluster validation, it's going to validate all the different characteristics of the node, from communication to storage to networking to OS configuration, update levels, roles and features that have been enabled, validate all of those different settings and ensure that we are building on a solid foundation. It's incredibly important as part of the process of creating a cluster. Okay, that's been successful. We validated the cluster. It's suitable for clustering, so that's great. We can carry on and create the cluster now by defining a name for our cluster. And in addition to that, we want to assign an IP address in our environment to this cluster resource so that we can communicate with it effectively. So we'll click Add. And then finally, we'll go ahead and create the cluster. So we're building on that solid foundation through the validation process, and we're finally now actually creating the clustered infrastructure. And that just takes a few moments, and there we're done, quick as a flash. So next, we're on to specific storage settings. Specifically here, we're going to clean the existing drives within these hyper-converged nodes. And with that done, we're going to verify everything looks good. 4 drives in each. It's a small scale environment, but that's fine for the time being. Then we're going to validate storage spaces direct specifically to ensure that everything is as expected, everything's working effectively. Yep, all looks good. And then finally, we can click Next to enable storage spaces direct functionality as part of our hyper-converged infrastructure. And you'll see it starting the relevant resources, services, health providers, and within just a few moments, we'll have a storage spaces direct enabled hyper-converged cluster running on Azure Stack HCI. So we can click Finish, and that's it, we're all done. Now that our cluster is created, we can enable the integration with Azure. Now, Azure Stack HCI has native integration with Azure, not only from a billing perspective, but once registered with Azure, the foundation is set for centralized Azure-based monitoring, update management, and more. So let's take a quick look at that registration process. So here we are on one of our management workstations, and I've opened up the PowerShell ISE environment to actually run a few commands that we need to configure the registration of the Azure Stack HCI system. So firstly, let's go ahead and let's select that top script here, which is basically going to run a remote command against our Azure Stack HCI nodes and install the necessary Azure Stack HCI components that are required for this registration process. So fairly quick. I'm going to install some stuff locally on my management workstation, the module from the PowerShell gallery, which I'm going to accept the prompt there. So it's going to download the necessary bits and install the modules that are required for me to run the registration process from this particular management workstation. So that's easy enough. And then finally, this last command, again, going to run remotely against our first node in our cluster to check the status of the registration. As you can see from the output there, it's not yet registered. We've just finished the cluster creation process. That makes sense. So let's go ahead to this registration tab here, and let's run this command, which essentially takes a set of inputs, including a subscription ID in Azure, some resource name and resource group names that are going to be created in Azure. And then we're going to run this against this Azure Stack HCI node remotely. So I'm going to select all of that. I'm going to run that selection, and you'll see it's going to go ahead and pull down modules. It's going to install necessary components. It's going to create necessary resources. So you'll see at this stage, we are downloading bits. We are installing required PowerShell modules, including Azure AD, logging into Azure. So I'll provide some necessary credentials with the appropriate level of permissions to create the necessary resources, both in Azure and in Azure AD. So you'll want to work, if you're not the global admin, with your global admin to enable that if that's the case. So it's registering, creating an AAD application, resource groups, granting consent for the AAD app. Everything happens really quickly and then done. So our Azure Stack HCI cluster, if we hop over to the Azure portal now, is registered. So if we go to the Azure Stack HCI resource provider, there it is. There's our cluster. Let's click into that and you'll see the resource group name, you'll see the nodes, you'll see that we're connected to Azure. More health and update management capabilities are coming soon, but right now we can see some useful information about our cluster. And let's go over to Azure AD just for completeness and see what was created there under app registrations. You'll see under all applications, there's our cluster and the actual Azure AD application that was created as part of that. And if we look at the permissions, you'll see that it's used for billing and metadata and information about the Azure Stack HCI cluster. And that is pretty much the registration process completed. Final thing to check is just to see what's the status now, and you can see that cluster is listed as registered, and we're all good to go. Now that the cluster's registered, there's a couple of additional steps you'd likely want to perform, and the first is to configure the cluster witness. Now, for those of you not familiar, at a high level, the quorum for a cluster is determined by the number of voting elements that must be part of active cluster membership for that cluster to start properly or continue running. Now, each node typically has what's called a vote, but in the case of a cluster with an even number of nodes, like our 2-node cluster, we ideally need a witness to provide the third decisive vote. Now, historically, the witness needed to be some sort of shared disk, such as a LUN presented from your SAN. But more recent versions of Windows Server supported an SMB share acting as the witness, even locating that SMB share on a USB drive attached to a switch or router. Azure Stack HCI also supports a cloud witness, where Azure Blob Storage is used as the witness, and that's what we're going to set up right now. Okay, so we're back in the admin center. Let's go to our cluster, and we're going to explore the cluster-wide settings in order to define the cloud witness configuration. So we'll go settings there, and we'll go to the witness, and you'll see that we've got in the drop down here a set of options relating to what we discussed earlier: cloud witness, disk witness, or file share witness, which could also be on a USB stick. So I'm going to go for cloud witness, and you'll see we've got some Azure specific form entry fields here that we're going to have to get that information from Azure. So let's tab over to the Azure portal and start to retrieve some of that information. Okay, so in the Azure portal here, I've started the wizard for the creation of a storage account. And I've actually started to define some very simple information. Choose my subscription, give it a resource group name, a storage account name. We're also going to define the location, in this case East US. General purpose storage is fine, and locally redundant storage for replication. We don't need to change anything for the networking. We can keep this simple for our example. Obviously your environments may differ slightly, and data protection is fine with the defaults for now. And in terms of advanced settings, I'm actually going to drop down and increase my TLS version to 1.2. But beyond that, I don't really have to do anything else at this point in time. So I'm going to flip through the wizard, validate the final settings, and then go ahead and create this storage account. So easy stuff so far, and that's going to take a few moments to actually initiate and then finalize that deployment of the new storage account. You can see, there we go, quick as a flash. So let's go to that resource, and there's a few key pieces of information we need to grab from the access keys view here. So we know the storage account name already, that's what we defined. The keys are the important piece, and we're going to select just the first key, of which you can regenerate them if you wish to. Back to the admin center, I'm going to paste that in before I forget it. I'm going to define the same names that we had listed in the Azure portal there. And then the service endpoint for the Azure cloud, the regular Azure cloud, is core.windows.net. And just like that, we'll click save. And that is us done. Simple as that. So that witness is now configured, and we're good to go. So the next stage in the process is to actually perform some of the day one operations, like creating a VM. But before we do that, we need to define some storage. So let's go to our volumes view here. Let's select our inventory, and we should just have a single defaultly created volume. We're going to create another one. We'll call this one, I'm going to change the name slightly, volume 1. It's going to be a two-way mirror on our 2-node cluster. We'll set it as 50 gig in size. And we're going to enable some of the more advanced features like dedupe and compression, specifically because we're going to be storing Hyper-V VMs, and we can make some good savings there. We expose these features up front to make it easy. I'm not going to choose any of the additional advanced features. I'm just going to go ahead and create. And that's going to take a few moments. There we go. Now, one additional setting, if we explore that, you'll see I could actually turn on dedupe here and BitLocker for encryption. One additional setting that I like to perform, and we can see some more nice interfaces here, some nice dashboards and so on. I'm going to select this path. I'm going to go over to our cluster-wide settings again, and I'm going to set our settings for our default storage paths to be that cluster storage that we just defined previously. So we'll save that. We'll go into VMs again. Now we can create a simple virtual machine. So let's go to the inventory. We'll create a new virtual machine. We're just going to create a dummy virtual machine. It's not going to have an operating system in there, but just for the purpose of demonstration. You see it's picked up our standard paths there. We're going to up the memory a little bit. We'll turn on dynamic memory. We'll connect it to the network with our compute virtual switch, and then we'll add some basic virtual machine storage. And just like that, our VM creation is kicked off. So really straightforward stuff. And there we go. Now, one final thing we can show in terms of starting that VM up. Let's kick it off. And let's go into the settings of this VM, or let's click on the VM and take a look at its properties. We'll see lots of information about that virtual machine there. I'm going to connect to that VM to show how easy it is to interact with the virtual machine. It's going to prompt me for some accepting the certificate. I'm going to enter some credentials to access this VM. And you'll see it's obviously not got an operating system, so it's going to attempt a Pixie boot in this case. I'm going to come back out of there and go to virtual machines and show you how easy it is to initiate a live migration by selecting that VM, clicking more, clicking move, and you'll see I can choose another server in the cluster, or just the cluster in general. It's going to move it to the best node available in that cluster. And that is a live migration kicked off using the Windows Admin Center. And that VM's now been moved. So again, easy stuff, some cool day one operations. Azure Stack HCI can also integrate with a number of additional Azure services, including services that offer business continuity and disaster recovery, to those that extend your on-prem capacity up into Azure. In addition, as we learned earlier, we can centralize management in Azure, not only for the Azure Stack HCI clusters themselves, but also for your guest workloads, helping to secure, monitor, update, and govern your on-prem workloads, all from Azure. So let's take a quick look. So here we are in Admin Center again, and I'm going to click on one of our cluster nodes in particular. And you can see on the left-hand side of the menu here a number of Azure extensions that are enabled within our Admin Center. If I go to settings here, to enable some of these and integrate, you need to sign in with an Azure account. And also, if I click on this Azure option under Gateway here, register your Windows Admin Center with Azure. Fairly easy, doesn't take long at all. But with those steps performed and completed, let me go back to our view here. Let's click on the Azure Hybrid Services and give that a second to load, because that's going to pull the latest information down for us about the Azure services. And you'll see Admin Center integrates and showcases a number of points of integration with Azure services. Backup, file sync for extending our local storage, network adapter for point-to-site VPN for on-premises servers to an Azure VNet, site recovery, which we'll look at more in a moment, integration with Azure Monitor for logging and alerting, applying policies, update management, protecting your environment with integration with the Security Center. And some of them say coming soon, but some of them are available in preview on the left, as you can see there as well. So what you'll see is a number of these Azure services that I've started to integrate with my Windows Admin Center already. But let me show you how easy it is to use one in particular. And the one I'm going to choose is over on this other tab for this cluster. I'm going to click on Virtual Machines. We're going to take a look at the Site Recovery option here to enable and integrate with this hybrid service. You'll see it called out at the top here to set it up. But I'm going to go to Inventory here. I've not set this up previously, so this is the first time. I'm going to click on this particular virtual machine that we created earlier, and I'm going to set up protection. And that is essentially Windows Admin Center saying, let's enable this VM with Azure Site Recovery Protection. So it's going to instruct me to create a new resource group in Azure. So again, I need the right permissions for this in my Azure subscription. I'm going to click on the region I want to create there, just a few pieces of data entry, and click Setup. And simple as that, Windows Admin Center is going to coordinate and orchestrate the integration and setup of Azure Site Recovery for that particular virtual machine. Really straightforward stuff, and awesome integration. And so to wrap up, we've covered a lot there, and I'd urge you to continue your learning around Azure Stack HCI by checking out the evaluation guide, which will help you walk through setting up an Azure Stack HCI environment. And of course, there are some additional video resources that you can check out that cover Azure Stack HCI, Windows Admin Center, and more. So with that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see you next time.